sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined, as usual, by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, welcome to the third and final week of our takeover of The Politics Guys.
You know, we think it's the third and final week, but we've just received word that Michael has a flat tire in the Pyrenees somewhere, and we don't know if he'll be able to make it out of there by next week.
That is true. I mean, it's still up in the air whether or not we let Jay out of your basement. There's all kinds of
all kinds of contingencies. So I'm keeping next Friday clear, Trey.
Just in case, right? That's a good plan. That's a good plan. I mean, and who knows? The United States might not even take him back into the U.S. You know, they'd be like, "Listen, you're trying, you're a defector, right?" I mean, and if you think about it, it was a good week to be a defector. I mean, first it's to North Korea, and then it's seriously though, don't defect to North Korea. It's a bad plan. Not that we're going to take that particular story on today, but we do have a bunch of good things to go on this week. We're going to be talking about cool things like the Israeli president's speech to a joint session of Congress. We're going to talk about some grain deal changes. We're going to talk about the Illinois Supreme Court case on cash bail and a whole lot more. But that's what we're taking on this week. And I thought where we would start, because I think it was probably one of the bigger items, Ken, was Israeli President Isaac Herzog's joint session speech to Congress this past Wednesday. But it also, of course, was the drama leading up to it. And I think some of the really real divisions in the Democratic Party that have existed for some time. And I get that. And it really centered originally and earlier in the week when Congressional Progressive Caucus Representative Pramila Jayapal. I always get her name wrong. Ken, say that.
Jayapal. I'm not exactly sure about her first name either, but Jayapal is correct for her last name.
Okay, so I did. Okay, yeah. Okay, we're gonna Representative Jayapal because I know that's what I have. My apologies on that front. I always want to get people's names right. She called Israel, quote, a racist state, end quote. Now, that came under a lot of kind of bipartisan fire, and she would end up walking back her comments. But it did end up leading to kind of a show vote on a measure to declare that Israel is, quote, not a racist or an apartheid state, end quote. Now, that, although did not get unanimity, as a matter of fact, 9 Democrats still voted against it. As a matter of, including arguing that Israel, in fact, does support racism, murders, and apartheid in the statement. Now, there's a lot of history here, Ken, and I thought I would just give us a quick thumbnail sketch for listeners. I think Israel is one of those things we recognize. We probably don't necessarily know its modern history. So following World War II, the British withdrew from the area that we know as Palestine, and the United Nations proposed partitioning the area into an Arab and Jewish states. And that idea is what we oftentimes call the Balfour Declaration that comes in 1917. This is during what you think of as being the British Mandate period. Now, the British, they weren't particularly interested in that. Now, that arrangement was rejected by Arabs who were upset, and understandably in many ways, by the large influx of Jews coming into the area before and after World War III. As a matter of fact, there's even a famous agreement with the Nazis in 1933 to allow some Jewish people in. And likewise, you understand the desire for Jewish people to get away. Now, following World War II, the British withdrawal, but the British actually opposed either an Israeli or an Arab state, and it disapproved of immigration. Now, this is something I think this is really worth noting. There's this really wrong view of history, and in this telling of history, Hitler is kind of this outlier of anti-Semitism, but really, in truth, he's not, right? I mean, European anti-Semitism is long-standing. He just might be what you might call the most egregious of it in many ways. But that is one of the reasons you have this kind of influx of individuals into the area we're going to eventually know as Israel. Now, after the death of FDR, Harry Truman appoints individuals to study the issue, and in 1946, Truman declared support for a Jewish state. Now, this was consistent with the United Nations Partition Resolution, which was going to be, again, that two-state resolution, but that actually wouldn't come to be. As a matter of fact, we would end up having the fastest recognition of another country ever, when on the same day, President Truman would recognize Israel as a state. Now, this created Arab anger, and this leads to the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Now, we could spend a whole show just talking about, what comes after that, the Oslo Accords in 93, the ending of status with the election of Hamas in 2006. But that's kind of the brief thumbnail of the sketch of Israel. Now, what makes this particularly weird, Ken, and I'm curious about your opinion on this, is that there is a constructed sense of Jewishness that is modern or sometimes considered to be Zionist, that says there has to be kind of a nationality that exists in the wake of what we think of as being the Holocaust. And I think there's a lot of sympathy for that in the United States. But at the same time, there is a lot of anger at that from Arab quarters, which is also combined undoubtedly with a significant amount of Arab anti-Semitism, although that's not all of it, all centered in one area where you've now had a lot of conflict. And I think you saw a lot of that coming up in Congress. So what do you take away from what was going on this past week about that, with that kind of little bit of background, or if I've missed anything you think that would be useful here?
Yeah, one thing I'll add to the context that you gave, which I think is relevant to what happened this past week, is so you talked about how German anti-Semitism was reflected in broader European anti-Semitism, and when in the early years of Hitler, when he would have allowed Jews to emigrate, other European countries would not take very many of them, and that caused a lot of problems. One thing I would parallel that with, which you didn't talk about as much, is a fairly analogous situation with the Palestinians. After the formation of the State of Israel, so when you have the original UN partition in 1947, there's two states created. There's Israel, and there's a state that was then called Transjordan. And Transjordan is the country that today is still Jordan, on the east bank of the Jordan River, and also the territory that today is the West Bank, which is the occupied Palestinian territory. That's where Israel has a military occupation, and all of that is Transjordan in the UN mandate. And so the Palestinian people, the people that today call themselves Palestinians, they're a minority ethnic group within Transjordan at the time of partition, and the majority ethnic group within Transjordan are the Hashemite Arabs, and the Jordanian royal family are Hashemites. And their views of the Palestinians are pretty similar to European views of the Jews. There's just a lot of anti-Palestinian sentiment among the Hashemite Arabs and among all the other Arabs. And the Palestinians who were living under military occupation and still are, Israel, did try to encourage emigration, just the way Hitler had tried to initially encourage emigration of Jews. And but similarly, just like other European countries wouldn't take Jews, other Arab countries wouldn't take Palestinians. And the 1948 war, which all the Arab countries launched against Israel, doesn't change the borders very much, but it's the 1967 war, which I think you didn't mention, that
that's the one that changed the borders
very significantly. Yeah. So the Arab countries attack again in 67, and this time Israel not only repels them, but it moves forward into Jordan, into Syria, and into Egypt, and takes large amounts of territory from both Jordan and Egypt, and smaller amounts of territory from Syria and Lebanon, and then later there's a peace treaty with Egypt during the Carter years, and the Sinai Peninsula, which was the Egyptian territory that Israel took, was mostly given back to Egypt, although a little bit of that, the Gaza Strip, remains under Israeli military occupation. With Lebanon, there's similar agreements. For a while, there's an occupation in an area called the Golan Heights, but that does get given back in a peace deal with Lebanon. But with Jordan, Jordan never wants back the West Bank. And so, Israel, at a time when Israel would have bargained to give back the West Bank in exchange for peace, Jordan actually offers peace and doesn't want the West Bank back. And so they end up doing a peace deal with Jordan that traps the Palestinians inside Israeli military occupation. And that's been the situation ever since. So I actually think it's not unfair to call Israel an apartheid state now. I think it is an apartheid state. There's that history that may explain that. But you have a group of people who are Palestinians living in a territory that's under Israeli military occupation. They don't have their own country. They're not able to rejoin Jordan because Jordan won't take them, and they don't have anywhere near the kind of rights that people in Israel have. Now, it's not identical to a South African apartheid state because there's also Arabs and Muslims who live in Tel Aviv and Haifa and all the Israeli cities, and they have ordinary rights. So if you have Israeli Arabs who live in the pre-1947 part of Israel, they have generally all the same political rights Israelis have, although they're not required to serve in the army. But if you have people living in the West Bank, which is, we're talking about maybe 25% of all the territory of Israel here, then if they're Jews, they have rights, and if they're Palestinians, they don't. And so I think that's fair to call it an apartheid state. In fact, I think one of the most hypocritical things about the U.S. House of Representatives denouncing the idea that Israel is an apartheid state is that the U.S. until this week participated in propping up some of the apartheid rules. That only ended because of this appearance. But one of Israel's apartheid rules was that if foreign people want to come visit Israel, and that includes U.S. citizens, if U.S. citizens want to come visit Israel, their race and ethnicity is taken account of, and it was actually impossible for a U.S. citizen of Palestinian ethnicity to travel to Israel. It just wasn't legal, even though they were a U.S. citizen, until this week. And so that's that I don't see how anyone could say that's not an apartheid state.
Now, I mean, this is one where I have balance, but I may push back a little bit here to say that I do think that I understand and am sympathetic to the Israeli position of Palestinians, given the multiplicity of wars they had to fight for their very existence. And that creates a situation in which you're going to have a level of hesitancy. And so I think it might be, it's easier for the two of us to say, well, of course you need to have inclusivity for Palestinians. But that's not an easy thing from the point of view of individuals who have dealt with, more terrorist activities, bus bombings than really any other country has ever experienced. That's going to be reflective in your politics. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it morally right, but it certainly, I think, explains why you're going to have some of those hesitancies. Yeah. Again, combined with the fact, as you rightfully noted, you've had multiple wars to wipe you off, to wipe you out of existence, that come in the wake of a Holocaust that attempts to wipe you out of existence. Right. So I can't disagree with our overarching point of saying, look, it's a different kind of apartheid. Yet I can't help but be at least more supportive of it in a sense, in the light of when you take those holistic into consideration. What do you think about that?
Right. I agree entirely. I wanted to add the extra context about the Palestinians, and I think Israel is between rocks and hard places, and that they have more bona fide security threats from their neighbors than almost any country in the world. Maybe Ukraine has worse, but Israel
Well, I mean, I guess
has.
the difference being is imagine if you're Ukraine and you're surrounded.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's I see why they have some of the policies that they have, and there have been times in their history where there have been existential threats that have made them do things that you wouldn't want to, we wouldn't condone under other circumstances, but it become understandable. But I think that I don't think it's wrong, nonetheless, to say, well, if Israel's defining a group of people based on a combination of their ethnicity and their zip code, and saying, those people, because they're Palestinian ethnicity and because they live in territories that are considered occupied territories, there's a zillion things they can't do, and even foreigners who just want to come visit Israel, their ethnicity will be taken into account in terms of whether they're even allowed to or not. I don't shy away from the label apartheid. I think I do shy away from the label racist, and I know both of those things were wrapped up in the Jayapal statement, and both of those things were wrapped up in the House resolution. Whereas I think it's because of the ongoing threat of terrorism and war, some of these apartheid measures may not be motivated by racism, but I still think they are apartheid measures, and I would call them that. By the way, I'd say the same about the United States with respect to the voting rights of people living in territories like Puerto Rico, right? Like, we have a class of lesser citizens. If they live in Puerto Rico, they can't vote, but they're U.S. citizens. And now, in their case, they can just move up to the 50 states and vote. The Palestinian people are not even allowed to do that. They're not allowed to move into Israel if they want to. They have to stay in the occupied West Bank, whereas the reverse is the opposite. Israeli Jews can move anywhere in the West Bank or in Israel. They can come or go as they please, but people of Palestinian ethnicity who live in the West Bank can never even come into Israel. Some of them can get permits to walk in during the day and go to work, but they have to walk home at night. They can't stay overnight. They can't relocate. They can't get the rights that the Israeli Arabs have. So I think change needs to happen, and I basically do support the efforts of people like the 9 or 10 Congress members who raised these issues. I support their efforts to raise the issues. I certainly support the right of the state of Israel to exist and to be free of terrorism and war. But I think there's ways to do that, particularly the two-state solution that the Oslo Accords, which you mentioned, actually contemplated, and which the subsequent Israeli governments sabotaged. But there was this moment in time in 1993 where there was a path to a two-state solution where the Palestinians, Jordan didn't want them back, but they could have had their own Palestinian state, and there were a blueprint in place to get that done, and then it just never got done.
Well, and let's be honest, that I'm not even sure that's a possibility today, in part because of the popularity of, like, when Hamas won elections in 2006, which I had just kind of briefly mentioned. I mean, you effectively have a terrorist organization taking control and would take control of the state. And so I hear and understand the desire for a two-state, but I'm not sure you can pragmatically do it, because you would instantaneously have effectively a terrorist state living on your border. I don't know what you do about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, right. That complicates things compared to 1993 when that wasn't the case, but it doesn't make it impossible. I mean, if you think of a situation like within 5 years after the end of World War II, Germany and Japan had been under Western military occupation, and the governments are reconstituted there. Now, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were much worse terrorist aggressor states than the Palestinians have ever been. And within 5 years, they're reconstituted, but under still some foreign supervision and under very strict restrictions on their own ability to militarize, which actually Japan came to love, and they never wanted to militarize again after that. I think there's ways to do things like that. I mean, if we could rehabilitate Germany and Japan in just 5 years, you're talking about, much more dangerous states than the Palestinians could ever be.
I think the only problem in that analysis there is it doesn't take into account the kind of ethnic hatred that festers there, right? I don't think they're what, Germans on their face did not have a national or an ethnic hatred for British or American people, which I think might complicate.
Well, they had it for they had it for Slavic people who were on their other borders, and the Japanese certainly did have it for Chinese and Korean people.
No, that is fair. That's true.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think they worked through it.
So now let's bring this to the United States to kind of finish it up. You had started to move in that way anyway. You had said you were kind of supportive of the Democrats who had made this position. Obviously, it's a minority position in the Democratic Party, but it's an emergent position, and it's certainly a divisive position. What do you think this means? I think, one of the things over the last few years I've noticed is we focused a lot of our time, and not wrongfully, but rightfully so, on the emergent divisions inside the Republican Party and its positions in the Trump and post-Trump era. And I think a lot what that has done, though, it's not as if the Democratic Party hasn't been undergoing its own shifts. It's just that those shifts have not gotten the same kinds of attention. And so one of the things that I was seeing this week in this story, Ken, was, here's one of these moments when some of those changes, shifts, and divisions, the Democratic Party are coming to the fore again as things stabilize in terms of Republican Party. I mean, again, not where I necessarily would have wanted it, but as they come to stabilize, it means that we'll again be talking about kind of these Democratic divisions. And what do you think about that on the domestic front?
Yeah, I mean, the Democratic Party has a coalition that, I think the logic of the whole coalition is kind of the anti-Trump coalition. But in terms of which domestic policy issues they prioritize, there's definitely a wide range of views. Yeah, even foreign. Now, on this foreign policy view, although my own sympathies are with the 9 or 10 House members who were willing to use the word apartheid, I don't have any illusions that that's a serious schism within the party. I think the overwhelming weight of the party is on the other side of that issue. And you think of people like Chuck Schumer sort of setting the mainstream Democratic policy on that. It's fairly reflexively pro-Israel. And I'll say, even to me, although we're just talking about this from a kind of academic standpoint, and I think it is fair to use the word apartheid about Israel. I don't know that even the name calling helps. Like even I would say it might have been better, for Jay Paul not to use that word in public, even as she tried to advance the positions that I agree with that she was advancing, because it always becomes inflammatory and leads to rancor, and you don't really want that within the Democratic Party. It would be easier to get more Democrats on board to talk about ways that the U.S. could play a positive role in bringing about peace in Israel, than to throw around names like a apartheid state. But I think foreign policy. I don't think it's a big division. I think in foreign policy, most of the Democrats are not only going to be basically pro-Israel, but they're basically going to be, pro-democracy and be willing to, use the military might to sustain democracy. And I don't think there's been a lot of dissension within the Democrats on things like involvement in the Ukraine war, to the extent we've been involved. Now, there's a tiny bit of dissension, but I think it's really like you're talking about 95% versus 5%, and that's inevitable. I think on domestic policy, there's probably more wedge issues where the Dems are a bit divided, particularly with respect to policing type views, policing the cities and the connection to the Black Lives Matter concerns. I think there's a real divide there about what's the right position to take.
Yeah.
A more even divide. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And and so, but I do think as long as Trump's part of the picture, that's not going to weaken the Democratic coalition any. I think the Democratic coalition is extremely highly motivated to maintain unity to fight, Trump and the anti-democracy movement in this country, and that it would only be, if that threat would disappear, then I think some of these divisions within the party would become more problematic.
No, I think this is the last electoral cycle where that's going to be true for Democrats. But we'll get to that now. I figured we would stay on the international policy side of things to start with, Ken. And so as we move into our second story, the other big item this week, of course, was yet another international relations story. And that was on Monday when Russia declared it was suspending a corridor that allowed Ukraine to deliver grains to global markets. The agreement, which went into effect last year in July, or the Sea Grain Initiative, was ended by Russia, and they indicated that it was part, really just, quote, narrow self-interest, end quote, on the part of the West. Now, wheat prices, as you might imagine, have jumped as the supply is going to be significantly lower. It's hard to overemphasize how much foodstuff comes from Ukraine. Now, what is, I think, worth thinking about, because we had talked about this last week, and of course, where a lot of this grain actually ends up headed, for those of you who are interested in these kinds of things, is Turkey and China. That is actually where the bulk of Ukrainian grain is sold. So much so, as a matter of fact, Turkey's president thought it was going to continue. And one potential reading of the international room is that Erdogan's relationship to NATO, kind of maybe in the view of Putin caving a little bit to the expansion of NATO, might have led to this. In other words, this might not be pointed so directly at the West, but it might actually be pointed at Turkey primarily and maybe secondarily at China. It will at least affect them in that view. There are some individuals who are arguing that perhaps this is a short term. Putin is headed to an African conference, and there's one thought that maybe, he's going to reinstate it there to kind of look, like the big guy. I'm not sure. I think the Turkey read might be the best read on what's happening here, but it certainly complicates what's happening internationally, because now we have another sea, which is clearly going to be a combat zone, and Russia has declared that. Well, what do you think about all of this, Ken?
Yeah, it's so hard to predict where things are headed here because there's so many moving parts. On your analysis, I agree. I think both that it is directed at Turkey, that Putin thought that he still had Erdogan in his pocket, and in some ways he largely does. But on super public things like the NATO vote about whether to admit Sweden, the pressure on Erdogan from the opposite direction was just overwhelming, and so I think he is trying to retaliate against Turkey for that. Similarly, as you mentioned, I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but with China, we talked last week about how
we did
the friendship between Russia and China is maybe souring a little bit, and this might be a little shot across China's bow as well. I think also I think it's, to the extent that NATO is now growing and becoming more involved in the region, it could be just militarily a way that Putin's throwing down a gauntlet, and he's sort of saying, look, you might end up having to either respect my ability to embargo Ukrainian wheat, or you might have all of NATO having to come into a military engagement with with Russian ships at sea, and then that threatens a world war. And I think he's probably betting that he'll win that standoff, that Western ships are not going to go ahead and start what could be World War III by firing on these Russian ships. So particularly to help get wheat to China. And so I guess I still think there won't be a military engagement at sea. I think the NATO ships and the NATO political leadership will be too cautious to allow that to happen. And I think that we may just see Western countries, including the United States, propping up wheat shipments to Turkey and propping up financial aid to Ukraine to substitute for the money they would have made selling wheat to Turkey. And, as far as China, they might be on their own to figure out what to do about this. I don't think the U.S. is going to help, and the NATO is going to help them that much.
I don't see there being any assistance. Yeah. Turkey, yes. China,
Right.
no, especially right now.
Right.
We have some of the lowest Chinese relationships that we have had in, I think, our lifetime.
Yeah.
It's my lifetime.
So, but I still think as much as this is a crisis, and it's a severe, humanitarian and food crisis and a political crisis, it doesn't justify really escalating it up to a military engagement that could start World War III from the Western perspective. And I think that won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think really you're absolutely right on the front of there's not going to be an engagement in the sea, but it does raise the point of that Ukraine is going to definitely be more decimated than it would have been with this agreement in place. Even if you prop them up monetarily in the short term, that doesn't change the fact that you're going to have effectively a huge swath of the livelihood disappear. And that's not an infrastructure that comes back quickly. For those of you who don't know how the kind of farming infrastructure works, and that is not a positive signal, and that will obviously have to be kind of tweaked in everybody's variables about what a post-war Ukraine is going to look like. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways we have to have here.
Yeah, they're going to need, like a Marshall Plan to get their economy back up and running. But I think for the next year or two, they're basically going to have to be floated on aid, and to some extent that's what's already been happening. So it's more of a change in magnitude than in kind. I mean, there's already been a lot of foreign aid flowing there, and that's how people are surviving there. And hopefully the conflict will end and things can get moving back in a better direction.
Yeah, and again, I have been hesitant at any point to say when I think it might end. I know when it first, broke out that Ken and Jay both thought it was going to be over much more rapidly. I still am hesitant to try to make I just don't. I don't have the variables necessary to make that prediction. Well, I think before we return back to domestic politics, Ken, we're going to pause for just a minute, and then we're going to take up Illinois' Supreme Court potentially ending cash bail. So, Ken, on Tuesday, the Illinois Supreme Court upheld a law which eliminated cash bail. The bill, the Pretrial Fairness Act, changes how judges determine if someone is released from jail. Now, it ends having bail as part of that process. And that's a big deal because it was a very contentious portion of local Illinois elections last cycle. Other states like New York, New Jersey, and New Mexico have lowered them, but no other state to this point has completely eliminated them. Now, what brought this all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court is this portion of their Constitution. And it says this, quote, "All persons shall be bailable by sufficient sureties, except for the following offenses where the proof is evident or the presumption is great." And it goes on to list those there. And the question is, well, like, if you have all persons shall be bailable, can you get rid of that bailability? And that is where both the lower courts and some of the dissenters on the Supreme Court said, well, look, if you want to do this, if you want to get rid of bail, you actually have to change the 1970 Constitution. That, by the way, if you're following along, it's Article 3, Section 9 of their Constitution there. Now, the lower courts had ruled that you had that because the Constitution had bailability, it meant that there had to be something there. You couldn't just get rid of it. You, in fact, you could, but it was going to require more than a simple statutory shift. Now, the Supreme Court, again, the Illinois Supreme Court, disagreed. The dissent argued that, quote, "the legislature's abolishment of monetary bail is in direct violation of the plain language of our Constitution's Bill of Rights, and, more specifically, the vested rights of crime victims. Now, the three reasons for the disagreement is one, well, the language about bailability doesn't mean that it has to be monetary. Two, it assumed that ensuring bailability is the same thing as requiring money. And three, they suggested it misunderstood the history of the Illinois Constitution, which in this case, heads up, they've had a number of different versions, the most recent, again, being the 1970 version they were talking about. So we've got the legal question going on there, Ken. But behind that legal question, of course, is also the politics question, the policy question. And that is, what is the effect, and is having bail a good thing? So again, for those of you listening, remember bail when you're being charged with a crime, under certain circumstances, depending if you're going to be a flight risk, and state to state it varies, you can be required to put up money in order to not spend your time during trial in jail and rather be, out at home. A lot of organizations, including, your bar association, Ken, have argued that cash bail is problematic. Now, on the other side, there have been a lot of pushback. And again, this is one that's not exactly completely partisan in that sense. Taking a look at this, you're going to see that a majority of Illinois county prosecutors and sheriffs, and again, this is Illinois, we're talking about a lot of Democrats here, were against it and spoke out against it. As a matter of fact, one prominent sheriff argued, quote, "Today's ruling is a slap in the face to those who enforce our laws and the people those laws are supposed to protect," end quote. So I've been thinking about this carefully, both in the legal terms, but also in the policy terms. I know you're more comfortable in the legal side of things, Ken, so why don't we start there and you talk about this. The fact is bailability there. Does that mean that it needs to be cash bail or not? Do you agree with the Illinois Supreme Court? And then we can move and talk more about policy, which is where Illinois is trying to be on the forefront of a shift, policy and politically speaking.
Sure. So the legal question, in a limited way, it's only an Illinois legal question. What's the correct interpretation of the Illinois Constitution? But I do think it's pretty applicable in most American states because the language in the Illinois Constitution is fairly typical of what you'd see in many other state constitutions and in the U.S. Constitution for that matter. So, the U.S. Constitution has similar language too. So the idea is that substantially all these constitutions, including the Illinois Constitution, have as a right of criminal defendants that criminal defendants have a right to be released pre-trial if they haven't been tried and found guilty yet. They usually call that bail. So you get out on bail if you haven't had a trial yet, and we usually think that relates to money, although the idea of using money to set bail didn't actually start until the late 19th century, and this language in many of the constitutions is older than that. So, if you're an originalist
I thought its monetary sources was, as a matter of fact, Britain. Prior to the Revolutionary period was the beginning of cash bail, was it not?
Well, the Illinois Supreme Court opinion, says that it didn't start in Illinois until the 1870s.
Oh, you're talking. I'm so sorry. You could kind of expand the bail. I was like, wait a second, it has a longer history than the 19. Continue.
No, but I actually think that's typical. I think the Illinois practice and their court describes it as typical that cash was not a common method of bail in early American practice, and that cash bail became routinized later than when these bail provisions were put into these constitutions. So, and they really mainly talk about the Illinois one, but I think they're talking about that as being representative as well, and I think it is representative. And again, the other part that I probably want to emphasize more here is that the right to be bailed out before trial is a right of criminal defendants. It's one of their rights, like the right to have a lawyer, like the right to have a public trial, like the right to have a jury trial. So it's really not, the prosecutor's right. It's the defendant's right. The defendant has a right to be released before trial. but that's always been qualified on certain kinds of exigencies. So the two main exigencies that could deny an arrestee the right to be released would be either that they are releasing them would be dangerous to the community, or that they would be a flight risk. And if you release them, there'd be a reasonable or probable risk that they wouldn't show up for the trial. And so risk of flight or danger to the community have typically been grounds for not releasing people pre-trial. Now, the lower courts in Illinois, I think for reasons that were entirely ideological and really had almost nothing to do with law, the lower courts just wouldn't accept the idea that the legislature could eliminate cash bail. And instead of looking at this as a policy question where the legislature can balance the costs and the benefits of a cash bail system, which is what it should be, they sort of, I think, took some leaps of logic and said, well, since the Constitution mentions a right to bail, and since the right to bail in modern practice generally involves cash bail, and since the bail system has elements of protecting the community as well as elements of protecting the liberty of the defendant, the community's interests are sort of paramount here, and the legislature can't relax the cash bail requirement. I think that's both, it's just not at all consistent with the idea that bail is a right of a defendant, or with the idea that a defendant is actually presumed innocent until they're found guilty, and all of this happens at a time when they're still presumed innocent. So I don't see a lot of basis for any judge to say the legislature can't eliminate bail. Maybe an even broader way to put this is a state legislature's power has often been defined as what we call the police power. State legislatures have the power to protect the public safety, and that means the power to set policies that are optimal for protecting the public safety. And that's kind of a core power of a state legislature. And I think that would mean a state legislature could impose cash bail, or they could eliminate cash bail. Like the power to impose it had to be imposed to begin with by the legislature. There wasn't any power to impose it until the legislature gave that power. So the legislature should be able to take away that power. And I just think that's there's not really a serious counter argument. And I see this as kind of like, I guess, just right wing drum banging, that there's been a couple of judges out there who want to scream, look, you're going to all be murdered by criminals unless you vote for Republican judges. And that's kind of how I read those arguments.
Now the lower court, the district court, that was a Democratic judge, was it not?
I didn't think so. But it wasn't.
Now, at the Supreme Court level, you're absolutely right. It was right along partisan lines. I don't know about their appellate court, but I thought that the district court judge who issued the original ruling was a Democrat.
I'll defer to you on that. I don't know. I did notice this straight partisan split on the Illinois Supreme Court,
and that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
Yeah. And we've actually had a similar thing here in Ohio. In Ohio, there was an effort not to eliminate cash bail, but to cap how much could be charged for cash bail. And they were similarly, our state attorney general Yost, who's a Republican, was demagoguing on that. And I think there's a lot of politics. Where Republicans want to position themselves as tougher on street crime, and so they'll make these kind of very strained constitutional arguments about why the legislatures can't reform the bail system. But I think it would be a pretty unusual state constitution, and I haven't seen one. I'm not saying there aren't any, but I think it would be an unusual one that would actually make bail a right of the prosecutors rather than a right of the defendant. And it's typically seen that the right to be released pre-trial, which is enshrined in most constitutions, is a right of the defendant. And therefore, that defendant's right, it could never be unconstitutional for the legislature to enhance that right of the defendant and make it even easier to get out. Do you want to move to the policy question?
Yeah, let's move to the policy, because one of the things that I think makes this one difficult for me is I oftentimes see the debate over bail as being the second order issue that I'd want to take on. I mean, the reason that the question of bail is so important is because I think we've over-criminalized too many activities, and as a result, there's just too many people who make it through the court system as it is in that defendant way. So for somebody like me, I would like to see much bigger decriminalization of non-harmful activities like drug use and things like that. And so for me, sometimes I often think to myself, well, like, okay, we're having all of these issues with overcriminalization, which leads to weirdness with these institutions. Now, the institutions themselves might be problematic, and I'll get to that in a second. And I think there are some possible problematic natures to cash bail. But I see that as being second order to the problem of an overcriminalized legal system in most states. What do you think about that particular take, Ken?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think so. What you're pointing out, the way I would relate that to the bail debate is you're pointing out that there's a great many offenses that people could get charged with, that even if the charges are true and they're guilty of those offenses, those are not offenses that would imply that they're a danger to their communities. Exactly. Even if they were out, there's a lot of white collar crimes. There's a lot of maybe nonviolent blue collar crimes. There's all kinds of offenses that have been defined. Yeah, and I think that is a good argument for eliminating cash bail, because the cash bail elimination, as it happened in Illinois and as it's been suggested elsewhere, it doesn't mean that everybody gets out. It just means that the judge has to decide, would this person be a danger to their community if they were released? Would this person be a flight risk if they were released? And if the answer is yes, they would be a danger, yes, they would be a flight risk, the judge doesn't have to release them. He can just keep them locked up. But if the answer is no, they wouldn't be a flight risk and they wouldn't be a danger, then they can be released until trial time. And by the way, the release could be subject to other kinds of conditions. So there could be ankle bracelet monitoring and things like that to monitor their locations. There could be requirements that they check in. Excuse me. So the elimination of cash bail does not eliminate other safeguards to actually ensure, particularly on the flight risk side. If you put a ankle bracelet on somebody and monitor their whereabouts, then that can tend to reduce their ability to be a flight risk. They can even have home confinement conditions in some cases, where they're actually told, you have to stay home and you have to wear this ankle bracelet. And if you leave the house, or if the ankle bracelet comes off, then people are gonna come arrest you, and you won't be released out again. So with all those kind of safeguards, there's many crimes. We talked a couple months ago about the spate of public corruption prosecutions of elected officials. And a lot of these elected officials, they're not going to be a flight risk or a danger to their community if they are allowed out while they're waiting trial. And so I think generally those should be the big questions anyhow. If someone actually is a danger to the community, I don't really know why they should be bailable. Right. If you say, well, the serial killer they just picked up in New York, who's murdered like these 3 or 4 women, or is accused of that. I don't know why you would want to set bail and let someone like that back out. I think someone like that, you might as well just say he's got to be detained until trial. He's too dangerous to let out. But I don't really see what the purpose would be of saying, well, if someone like that can lay down a couple $1 million, he can walk out. Someone, the Jeffrey Epstein can walk out because he can lay down a couple $1 million. Someone who did the same things, can't. So I don't know what the benefit of that would be. And also another kind of modern problem that you have to think about if you have a cash bail system is these days it's not just that you'd have a disparate treatment between rich and poor. You'd also have an additional disparate treatment between people with political constituencies and people who don't have that because of the possibility of crowdfunding. Right. So you look at someone like Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, Wisconsin, arrested for homicide, and the bail is set at $2 million. And I guess the judge had decided, well, if he could post $2 million bail, he's not a danger to the community. But if he can't post $2 million bail, he is a danger to the community. And I don't know really where you get that from, like why that would make the difference.
I think,
but then
I
the way
mean, to give the other side a point, I think the idea is to say there might be a class of individuals who would not do it for good. I mean, they wouldn't behave themselves for altruistic reasons or further, but they might do it if there is in fact skin in the game, right? Like in other words, well, I don't want to lose my X amount of money, ergo I'm going to behave in a way that I wouldn't if I didn't have anything up, anything at stake. And I bring that up as the point, Ken, because one of the other elements of cash bail in the United States, at least, is right. We also allow it to be a business in the United States, right? So you can have bail bonds, which kind of complicate that. But I think that is at least the response is going to be to say, well, look, if you're Rittenhouse, okay, maybe I would play around with my AR. But there's a $2 million on me. So, but continue. I just wanted to kind of set that way.
So right. Yeah, no, because the reason I brought up Rittenhouse, of course, is because it's the opposite in his case, right? So here's a guy who has no skin in the game, right? So he gets on social media and he says, "Look, I'm a freedom fighter for the white race. I'm a patriot. Whatever. They're railroading me because I'm white. People should give me money to pay this $2 million bail." And the money comes in from all kinds of people he doesn't know, in $25 and $50 increments. And because of his ability to appeal to that constituency, he walks right out. He doesn't put any of his own money in there at all. And quite to the contrary, eventually at the end of his trial, he was acquitted. And so the bail gets returned. And in his case, it just goes right in his pocket. So the net cash bail for Kyle Rittenhouse, the effect of it is he had no skin in the game to walk out of jail. And he gets profited by the $2 million that all kinds of strangers put in there for him. And I think might be more like what the future of cash bail looks like. Like that kind of thing was still pretty new when Kyle Rittenhouse did it. But I think that's what the future of cash bail would look like. You'd see a lot of crowdsourcing. You'd see a lot of people accused of particular crimes kind of getting out there and saying, well, this is a witch hunt. I'm only accused of this kind of crime because the powers that be, hate my group and you're in my group, so you should give me some money. And then that skin in the game thing disappears, and the only criteria becomes who's able to harness social media to do that kind of crowdsourcing and who's not. And then this really perverse incentive to have massive profiteering from having been arrested and bailed out, which is exactly what Kyle Rittenhouse enjoyed.
No, and I think that's kind of an excellent point there. Okay, well, I think we need to move forward. And I think what we'll do next, Ken, to make sure our show goes on the right path here, let's take a look and talk a little bit about what's happening in Georgia next. So just a little over a month ago, the two of us actually had the opportunity to talk about Allen v. Michigan. That was back on June 3rd of this year. That case authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, and joined in part by Alito and in whole by almost all the liberal justices, held that there was a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, specifically that there are times when drawing voting districts must consider race, and Georgia had not done that. Now, as we talked about, I believe even last week, right, those districts, though, because they were being challenged, were actually used in 2022. But now they were having to be redrawn in the wake of the ruling in June. Now, as a reminder, national House districts are drawn by state legislatures. So the Alabama state legislature had to head back to the drawing board. Well, or did it? In this case, right, so the precedent, Roberts and Alito, again, I argue that they're kind of precedent guys. They held this up and said, look, the essence of a Section 2 claim is that there are certain electoral laws and practices or structural interactions with social and historical conditions that cause inequality in opportunities enjoyed by black and white voters, end quote. As a result of all that, the court comes down to this and it says, look, you're going to have a second black district, or in the words of the court, quote, something quite close to it, quote. Now, the Alabama legislature has been reading that second part generously. The Alabama House has currently in its new district a second 42% black district, but the Senate has one that is a second district that's only 38% black. Now, Ken, that has then led to obviously a lot of the individuals who were going through the original process saying, look, you're not changing this at all. But likewise, you have Republicans a little worried about what it might mean for them, including, for example, McCarthy, who has been saying, I'm following this really closely. So, I think oftentimes, when you're a listener, you might think, okay, well, the Supreme Court rules and that's kind of all there is to it. But not always, right? Sometimes actors push back. And this seems to be one of those, either a pushback or an attempt to have such a broad reading as to include in what you want in it. So what do you think about the House's 42% black second district and then the far less likely, I think, to pass muster Senate's 38% black district?
I haven't studied all the facts that the plaintiffs are alleging enough to, figure out exactly, how strong the proof will be that these were racially gerrymandered. I do know that in Georgia, before the redistricting, the Republican maps gave the Republicans a 8-6 majority in their House delegation. After the redistricting, the Republicans were able to increase that majority by 1 from 8-6 to 9-5 without actually increasing the percentage of votes that they got from voters in Georgia. So certainly gerrymandering played a role. Now, whether they'll be able to prove that was racial gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court recently reaffirmed does still violate the Voting Rights Act, or whether the Republicans will be able to make an argument that it could have been political gerrymandering that wasn't based on race, which the Supreme Court has said is not justiciable. In other words, not that it's permissible, but that courts can't do anything about it. I don't know. We'll have to see how the facts unfold. I like that the judge scheduled the trial for September. That's pretty soon. I think that's about as soon as would be possible. And that does imply that he's, taking the plaintiff's claims pretty seriously, because this judge certainly could have, slowballed this a little bit more than that. And that would have made it more or less impossible to get it done by the 24 election. So to me, that's an optimistic sign. But a lot of these things are going to come down to, what kinds of facts can be proved out about the deliberations that went into how they drew these maps.
Yeah, it's going to be curious. I mean, because again, having had just had Allen v. Milligan, does this meet what the court has said had to happen? The Supreme Court has said had to happen, and I think that's going to be the crux.
Yeah, and that would mean that the Supreme Court said that the states cannot make changes that reduce the status quo ability of minority voters to be able to have their vote counted equally with white voters. And so if it can be proved that that's what was done, that these changes were designed to reduce the impact of minority votes, then the plaintiffs are going to win the case. But the thing that makes that difficult is it can easily be proved. In fact, I don't think there's any counter argument that the changes favored Republicans and at the expense of Democrats. But the Georgia legislature is going to be able to make the argument. Well, yeah, but that wasn't based on race. That was just based on party affiliation. And so, to show that was based on race, I think is going to require some evidence, and that's where it's really going to come down to what can be brought into court.
Well, I think we've had enough time to have kind of maybe a footnote of a final story here, Ken, and that's the RFK Jr. hearing. And I think maybe just RFK a little bit broader himself. He's a weird guy. I mean, he's not going to win, but he actually is doing better than you might imagine in a primary right now. I was taking a look at the most recent numbers. He's consistently holding double-digit approval, most recently with Harvard Capps Harris poll. He still has a really high positive when you take a look among Democrats, which is weird in my position, 21%. Again, especially when you're running against an incumbent president like Biden. And then he finds himself in a strange place. So he's the Democratic nominee, but he's coming in at the behest this week of a Republican House committee, specifically on government censorship in that sense. And it comes in a week where he had made some really controversial comments where he had said, quote, "COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasian and Black people. The people who are most immune are Jews and Chinese," end quote. Now, Kennedy said, "Look, under oath, I'm not a racist. I'm not anti-Semitic. Really, what I am is I'm just, showing you what the research has said." Now, there is evidence to suggest in recent research that there's differences among different kinds of people for their susceptibility to COVID, but he was putting it into the context of it being kind of engineered as a quote unquote ethnic bioweapon, which is vastly different than just saying, look, there's different rates of infection among different kinds of people. And he ends up having this past week, during the hearing, a kind of a complicated set of interactions with Democrats. And, we had mentioned this earlier in terms of Israel, Ken, but I think a lot when I see the RFK conversations, when I see this going down, it's almost always kind of like RFK, the Republican. And I think, okay, I get that you put some of his views in the Republican side, but he's running. I mean, he could have opted to run in the Republican primary. Maybe he'd have some support there. I don't know how to begin to answer that question, but he's running as a Democrat. He's having this controversial hearing. He has a confrontation with Democrats. What do you make of RFK and kind of his weird location place here in the American consciousness during this electoral cycle?
Well, he's a Republican, and his running in the Democratic primary is a Republican operation to make mischief, and he can benefit the Republicans a lot more by running in a Democratic primary than he possibly could by running in a Republican primary. In fact, he would do the Republicans no benefit at all if he was running in a Republican primary. He would just cause some trouble for them.
In what way is he a Republican, though? I mean, other than, I know that he has some positions that are sympathetic that way. He's not, he's not a Republican and never has been a Republican. And his historical background is, as a matter of fact, kind of anti-corporatism Democratness.
Well, he, of course, his name is Robert Kennedy, and so that's a good name to have for Democrats, right? His
well, that's true
his father was one. Yeah, his father was one of the most beloved Democrats. His uncle John F. Kennedy was, a very beloved Democratic president that most subsequent Democratic nominees have tried to associate themselves with or affiliate with themselves with. Biden certainly does that. And I think the Kennedy name it carries a lot of weight among Democrats. And I think he in the past has been affiliated with the Democrats because that's just his family legacy. His views departed from the Democrats' views a long time ago, and he is on a straight, disruption operation now to disrupt the Democrats. He's not trying to appeal to Democrats. He's trying to undermine Democrats by running as a Democrat, sowing dissension, and espousing openly Trumpist views on everything, or even sometimes beyond Trump on his Trumpist views. And that's, of course, why all the Republicans in the House gave him, both the invitation and the extremely warm welcome and tried to prop him up, because they all understand that he's a Republican. Nobody in Congress thinks he's a Democrat. Nobody running in the Democratic primaries thinks he's a Democrat. He's just mislabeled himself because he has the benefit of that, because he comes from one of the Democratic dynastic families and has been a registered Democrat in the past, that it allows him to be kind of like a disinformation operation behind enemy lines under false flag. I mean, he's basically a false flag Democrat. He's running as under the false flag of being a Democrat.
I think that is a view of Democrats who don't recognize some of the deeper divisions within themselves. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I mean, and if I was a Democrat, I would be, if that was true, I'd be happy about that. But I don't think that's the case. So just for example, his anti-vaccine positions, which I deeply disagree with, the origin of anti-vaccination does not initially emerge among conservatives. It emerges among the kind of what you would call the crunchy left. And he was a part of that place and space and time. I think one of the things you have going on here is I think he does get dismissed as being a Republican. And I get that at a surface level. But I don't think that's actually the case. And I think what it indicates is that there is a subset of Democrats and liberals who do not fit the kind of the mainstream go. And as somebody who had been in the Republican Party, who had similar thoughts about earlier candidates, I would caution that you might make a similar mistake to discount RFK as having support in the Democrats, because again, some of these positions that he's had a long time, they aren't recent flops for him, but actually kind of organic growths that did emerge from Democrats. I mean, again, we think of I think anti-vaccination is a wonderful example of this. We think of that as being, in the post-COVID world, almost a defining, progressive, Trump feature. But really, again, the origin of that, California, Oregon, and leftists.
Yeah, but you're right that's the origin,
and that's
of
where he came from. I mean, he was doing that way back then when nobody paid any attention. I mean, Republicans are happy to glom onto him now, but it's not as if he wasn't that way and then he shifted now.
He was always an anti-vaxxer,
right? Yes.
And I'm sure that, and I'm sure there's some Democrats today who are also anti-vaxxers. But the point is, I would compare this to like the old Dixiecrats who all became Republicans, right? So you used to have like these Southern segregationist Democrats, and then after after LBJ passed the Civil Rights Act 64, the Southern segregationist Democrats, some of them hung on as Democrats for a while longer in name, but they became, kind of positioning themselves against the dominant branch of their party. And then over time, they mostly, just switched and came out as Republicans. And I think that's what you're seeing now. He's in that phase where, he had some views, which, by now, those are Republican views, not Democratic views. And he's in that phase where in his mind, he's already switched to being a Republican. And because the anti-vax thing, which you're right, it began on the left, but it doesn't play well in the Democrats now. It does play well in the Republicans now. And he's realizing that a lot of his views play well with Republicans now. And again, there's no bona fide Democrats that, Jim Jordan is kind of embracing in a bear hug the way he did at this hearing the other day. They all know that he's a Republican now, but it just benefits everybody's interest for him, since he's switched his views to being a Republican, but he happens to be branded with a famous Democratic name. He can do more good for himself and more good for the Republicans by just pretending that he's still a Democrat. But that'll end. I mean, it'll end by next year. I don't know if he'll actually join the Republicans next year. He may run as a third-party candidate next year when he doesn't get the Democratic nomination next year. But him running as a third-party candidate will be advancing a Republican strategy, and it'll be done. If that happens, all of his funding and all of his support is going to come from Republicans because they just want him to split the vote on Biden.
Well, I hear you. I my last minor warning is to say, beware of the crazy who runs in your party now.
Well, I know. And actually, what I was going to say is when you said I shouldn't dismiss him, I don't dismiss him. I condemn him. I think he could have a very serious. Yeah. I think he could have a serious hand grenade, like lobbing a hand grenade into this election. If he does run as a third party, that's the single most significant threat right now to Biden getting reelected, I think. More than I don't think there's any. Well,
can I ask you one? I don't want you to get too far. I have a quick question on that, because if he really is just a Republican and he runs as a third party, wouldn't that, if your first analysis is right, then wouldn't we suspect that would hurt Republicans, not Democrats? And if he hurts the Democrats, wouldn't that lead support to my thesis?
No, that's not what would happen, because if he brands himself as a Democrat who had to run on a third party, what I'm saying is he's fooling some people, right? He's not fooling anyone in Washington. Everybody in Congress knows that he's a Republican.
So he's pulling the eyes over some Democratic voters, effectively.
voters. Yeah, and particularly there is that kind of, still part of the Democratic coalition. You have these people who are, white, working class, over 50, maybe at one point in their life they were union labor, but now they're maybe underemployed and not really union labor anymore. There's that Midwestern demographic that kind of did help Trump win in 2016 in states like Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, who are Democrats, in part because they always were Democrats, but they're very open to the Trump messaging. And I think if he can peel off that demographic, it was only like 70,000 voters in that demographic who got peeled off in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in 2016 that flipped the outcome of the election. And so I think he poses a tremendous danger to do that. But I think, that's a demographic of people that would find it hard to pull a lever for someone with an R next to their name, although they did it for Trump. But they find it a lot easier to pull a lever for someone with an independent label next to their name, because they still, had identified in the past with being lifelong Democrats. And I think that's the electoral hand grenade that he poses. He's not going to get a ton of votes, but if he could get 2% of the vote, he could flip a presidential election that way, especially in some close states.
Well, I'm going to have to stop us there because we have gone long, Ken, and say that's it for this week, but it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it has been a lot of fun.
Well, so if you aren't already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without you, this podcast, it just doesn't happen. And not only does it not happen, but that's what gives us the ability to have the tools that we use to do this. And so we need you to be a supporter. Now, I'm not just asking you to be a supporter, though. You're going to get cool stuff for being a supporter, and I love it, right? You get ad-free versions of the show. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show. As a matter of fact, Ken and I are going to be recording that in just a few minutes. We're going to be continuing our view through the Constitution. We're into Article 4. We're going to be dealing with the rest of Article 4 today, and I'm really excited about that, and I want you to be able to listen to it ad-free, and you do that by becoming a supporter. You get other cool things, too, like access to our Discord channel, where we have conversations that kind of break away, not just from the stories that we do here, but deeper dives into them, and sometimes pretty deep arguments about philosophy, and we have all different kinds of channels, and I would love to see you as part of that. Now, how do you become a part of that? Well, the easiest way to become a member of the Politics Guys is to head to patreon.com/politicsguys and take a look at the level of support. Different levels of support get you different kinds of things. So if you head to patreon.com/politicsguys, choose the level of support that's right for you, and then join us on those midweek shows, or join us on Discord, or just enjoy something out of a coffee cup made by the Politics Guys. Now, there's other ways to support the show as well. We're also on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. To see all of that, all you got to do is scroll there down, or just look down at the links in the show notes. So just click on Read More, and all of our show notes will have access to the ways that you can support the show. If you like to do it old school, you can always head to politicsguys.com/support and see all the different ways you can support the Politics Guys. But again, the easiest is to head to patreon.com/politicsguys and choose your level of support so that you can listen to that Constitution show this week. Now, if you'd like to get our midweek show, but you're just not in the position to do that financially, we get that. As a matter of fact, I know there's a lot of you out there, you're working on dissertations, you're doing all kinds of things. We want you to hear that show as well. I oftentimes say, I get it. I've got 3 kids. I know how that is. If you just shoot an email to mike@politicsguys.com, we'll get you set up, and you'll actually get that on the regular as well. So please, again, just email mike@politicsguys if you're not in a position, but you want that exclusive midweek show. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, review us on whatever podcast app you use. Keep in mind, it's those ratings that put us up high enough so that new listeners can find us. So I know it seems terrible. The whole world is always asking you, hey, how was my support? Hey, how was our support? But it means everything. Just take 2 seconds, click the stars, and just write something like amazing, and then your day is done. If you've got a question, comment, correction, gripe, manifesto, or anything else you'd like to share, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. You can find all of this in the show notes. A special thanks, as always, to the executive producers of the Politics Guys, who were Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.